Shalom and welcome to the Israel Policy Pod. I'm Neri Zilber, a journalist based in Tel Aviv and a policy advisor to Israel Policy Forum. So this will be the last episode of the year, and what a year it's been. A full year, obviously marked by war. We'll be taking stock of the last 12 months and the last few weeks and the coming year with our two favorite guests, Israel Policy Forum's very own Chief Policy Officer, Michael Koplow, and Shira Efron, IPF's Diane and Guilford Glazer Foundation Director of Policy Research. Before we begin, a bit of housekeeping is in order. First, 'tis the season, as I say. So with the holidays and end of 2024 nearly upon us, do consider making a donation to Israel Policy Forum so we can keep doing what we do, including, of course, this podcast. And second, please take a moment to rate us on your podcast app of choice. And if the mood strikes you, please do leave a comment, hopefully a nice one. The powers that be tell me that these things do help. Think of it as your last bit of homework before you head off to the holidays. I'll wait. Okay, let's get to Michael and Shira. Hi, Michael. Hi, Shira. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Neri. How you doing?
Hi, Michael. Hi, Neri.
I was about to say, I'm doing okay, but I did not address the UN Security Council today. And for the record, we're recording this late Wednesday night Tel Aviv time. Dr. Shira Efron addressed the UN Security Council today.
She sure did. And she looked very, very fancy and formal doing it.
Yes, that was Michael's comment that he's never seen me dress like that. It's almost as bad as my mom telling me that I need to learn how to apply makeup. Yes, it was, I'll be serious for a moment. I think it was a huge honor that U.S. mission to the UN invited me as civil society representative. It's Ambassador Greenfield Thomas's last session as president. You know, this is the rotating presidency of the Security Council of the U.S., but obviously that's her last session. More important than my briefing, I think, is that right after me was Michael Levy, who is the first hostage family representative to ever address the UN Security Council. So kudos to the American mission for bringing hostage family representative to speak at this important session. And
also kind of shocking, maybe not surprising, but shocking that the UN itself had not done that.
Yeah.
But I mean, I was trying to be diplomatic and obviously and not to alienate UN folks with whom I work. And this is not a criticism about the UN as a whole, but are we really shocked that UN leadership didn't invite hostage families? I mean, look at the behavior of the UN over the past 15 months. It's been a huge challenge. I'm a big advocate of repairing. You know, we need a big rapprochement of Israel-UN relations for both sides' sake. But with the current UN leadership and the senior principals that are in critical roles, it's very difficult to do. So I agree with you on the one hand that it's shocking. On the other hand, so many shocking things have happened over the last year that by this I'm not as surprised.
Well, hopefully you're a lot less diplomatic on this podcast than you were addressing the Security Council, but yes, I think you're both.
And less elegant.
Yes, less elegant, but also this is audio format, and
that's right. Sure, you could be wearing a ball gown for all of our listeners now.
Yes, we should move to video. No, I am, for the record, wearing workout clothes after a boxing session. Yeah,
maybe in the new year we'll look into it. But on a more serious note, Michael Levy, I got to know very early after October 7th. His brother Ol was taken hostage. Ol's wife, they were at the Nova Festival. She was killed in one of the shelters on the highway outside the Nova Festival. And they have a young boy who's still waiting for his father to come back from Gaza. And so hopefully Michael's words and appearance in the Security Council will get certain people to do a lot more on that front, which we'll get into later on in this podcast. This is, of course, the last episode of the year. You both actually haven't been on since late October, so a lot has happened, to say the least, since then, not least of which there was a U.S. election. We'll sum up or try to sum up the year at the very top, and then we'll get into more recent events and then look ahead at what may be in store for us in the new year in 2025. So just to sum up and take stock and look back, I was thinking about this the other day, that a year ago exactly, the IDF had only just started its push into southern Gaza, into Khan Yunis. Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Dif, Ismail Haniya, all of them were still pretty much alive in Hamas. The war in Lebanon was on a low boil, and Hassan Nasrallah was also still alive and bloviating back then. We were all also kind of still rightfully terrified of Hezbollah's missile arsenal. Iran and Israel had yet to fire directly on each other as well back in December of 2023. Obviously, Bashar al-Assad was still in power in Syria, and Joe Biden was still the Democratic nominee for U.S. president. So my point is that it was a very different world back then, only 12 months ago. Michael, I wanted to start with you. Initial thoughts about the last 12 months and the events of this very momentous year, 2024.
I think for me, in a lot of ways, it's a split screen because you're obviously entirely correct in pointing out all of the ways in which things are different now versus a year ago. You know, everything you just noted, and perhaps the biggest one, the collapse of the Iranian axis of resistance, you know, not elimination, but certainly collapse. And the entire regional picture and regional architecture has transformed. And yeah, you think that a year ago, there hadn't been direct exchanges between Israel and Iran, and Sinwar and Nasrallah and all those guys were still alive. And now we're in a completely different situation in that respect. So an incredibly momentous year, one in which I think a lot of assumptions were shattered, particularly the assumption about Hezbollah's capabilities and what it would mean to actually go after Hezbollah for the Israeli home front. And Israel is sitting here, I think, going to 2025, coming off what's just an unbelievable few months with the decimation of Hezbollah, with the fall of Assad in Syria, and denying Iran not just now their most important proxy, but their most important forward operating base. So all of that is completely different. You know, in all of those respects, this has certainly not been a year of, it hasn't been a static year, right? It's been a year of enormous changes. The flip side to that, and why I say for me it's a split screen, is that if you look at the arena that started all of this, Gaza following the October 7th attacks, so yes, the Israeli military operation has progressed in important and demonstrable ways, but we're still sitting here a year ago with, I would argue, zero progress on what it looks like for the day after, zero progress on improving the humanitarian situation. And, you know, Shira is the expert on this one, not me, but, you know, it may be that it's even gone backwards. Zero progress, at least so far, and I know we all have our fingers crossed, on getting more hostages out, because the first and so far only hostage deal was in November of 2023, and we're sitting here in December 2024, and nothing in that respect has changed yet, even if the level of optimism at the moment is pretty high. You just look at the fact that Israel is going back into the same places now. You know, we spoke months ago about Israel going back into a place like Jabalia for the third time, and you know, now it's the fifth time, the sixth time. I've lost track. And so the Groundhog Day aspect of this to Gaza, even though so much has changed in Gaza and in terms of Hamas's military leadership and capabilities, the Groundhog Day aspect is very much still there in terms of the ultimate goals of this war, which include getting rid of Hamas governance in Gaza, which has not happened. So I think that if we're sitting here a year from now, still having the same conversation about Gaza itself, then you know it'll be important to, of course, highlight all the ways in which the region has changed for the better from Israel's perspective. But on this real core issue, you know, I think that we can very easily take whatever conversation we had 12 months ago about Gaza and probably replay it, and it won't be that far off.
Fair point about the Gaza front. Shira, same question to you. How do you assess the past year, looking back at it?
Wow. You know, what's interesting is that I think what happened over the course of the last year is almost we can't prepare sort of prepared remarks for podcasts such as this, right? Because by the time you prepare something, everything changes. It was an insane roller coaster. And I agree with Michael's, you know, sort of split screen and scorecard. Obviously, I mean, there have been really important military achievements and changes in the strategic picture all around us. I personally think it's too early to say what these changes would lead. And I'm sure, as we're looking forward and not reflecting backwards, maybe we can discuss those because, and this is not just an Israeli thing, right? It's also something that Americans do. We're pretty good. I mean, notwithstanding the catastrophe and colossal intelligence and operational failure of October 7th, but Israel and the United States are pretty good about going around and killing a lot of bad guys. But then filling this vacuum and capitalizing on the military instrument, right, to change a strategic picture and design a future that is better for Israeli interests, I think the jury's still out on that. And when I look around, obviously there's Gaza where we haven't made progress. I am praying and hoping and finally have some optimism about part of a partial hostage agreement at least, but we have 100 hostages remain in Hamas's captivity, right? We still have the number of injuries, PTSD. Israel's credit score is the 1988 levels. There is a brain drain. There's a diplomatic tsunami. Most airlines don't even fly here. There's the BDS, sort of like the overt one, but really the covert one, which is more concerning, is like, why would we even interact with Israelis? I mean, Israel's strategic picture, and I'm not just talking about, we can discuss, okay, what's happening in Syria. And yes, we killed Hamas's leadership. And arguably, I would say that we achieved the war aims, except for the most important one, which is bringing back the hostages. But is Israel better off? Yeah, better off than it was the beginning of this year, because this was the lowest point for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. But we're definitely not out of the clear zone. And we are not even speaking about domestic Israeli issues. The judicial reform or judicial coup is back full on. There are growing limitations on freedom of speech. Some people would say that Israeli democratic nature is already compromised with changes in the police. Yeah, I'm sure we'll get that. But anyway, I'm just going to say that, if we look at this year, harder for me to be as happy.
That's, again, all fair points. And we'll get into the domestic politics and also the figure of Bibi Netanyahu after this, like you said, roller coaster year in just a little bit. I'll take the more optimistic side of this argument and say that those military successes on the various battlefields of the Middle East weren't a given 12 months ago. Not in Lebanon versus Hezbollah, not with what the Israeli Air Force was able to do in Iran. Obviously, Syria was tangential, I'd argue, to the IDF, but obviously Israel's campaign against Hezbollah itself had an impact. And even in Gaza, right? I had to go back earlier today and I was looking at past articles for the Financial Times. I was looking for a specific quote, and I found an article I wrote in May of this past year talking about the strategic drift in Israel and the darkening of the national mood. And again, we were pretty much talking about Gaza, maybe a little bit about the Northern Front that was inconclusive back then. And that was really the vibe back in May and for a large part of this past year. And I've said this in recent podcasts, and I'll say it again over the past, 2 or 3 months, that has changed, that Israel essentially, quote unquote, won the war. The war is not over, especially since 100 hostages are still languishing in Gaza. But Israel has, for all intents and purposes, won this war. And now it's just a question of how you end it appropriately and what the day after looks like. And obviously Israel has a lot of influence on that question. So I don't know. I'm a lot more optimistic. Not on the domestic front, I should say. The domestic front, I'm a lot more pessimistic. But all of this was not a given 12 months ago, at least from my point of view. And for large parts of this year, I personally, and I know a lot of people felt the same way, I was very worried about a war with Hezbollah, like a full-on war with Hezbollah. And that did not transpire. So a mixed bag, but I think on the whole, this year could have looked very different. Thoughts, counter arguments?
I don't have a counter argument. I agree with you. It absolutely could have looked very different. And certainly on the northern front and with regard to Iran, it's been a remarkable year. I'll also say that I was about to say pleasantly surprised. I'm not sure I was surprised, but I guess it was a good example of Israel leveraging a military victory for political gains when it agreed to the ceasefire with Hezbollah with, by all accounts, stronger mechanisms than in 2006, and a side agreement that we're seeing in practice is letting the Israelis continue to attack Hezbollah positions when Israel has deemed Hezbollah to be violating the ceasefire provisions. So definitely wins. And I agree with you. I don't think any of it was a foregone conclusion. I guess just in continuing my role of being the Debbie Downer and being a pessimist by nature, I wish that same dynamic had applied in other areas, because it also wasn't a foregone conclusion that 100 hostages would still be left in Gaza. It also wasn't a foregone conclusion that Israel would be fighting the same battles in the same neighborhoods in Gaza. It also wasn't a foregone conclusion that there would be literally zero answer sitting here today any more than there was a year ago about what happens the day that Israel says, all right, mission accomplished in Gaza, what comes next? So certainly, let's highlight the wins, and they really are enormous and impressive, and all credit to the IDF and to Prime Minister Netanyahu and the government of Israel for greenlighting the things that happened in the north that changed that situation so dramatically for the better, at least for now in the short term. But I can't help but ding them for continuing to drag their feet and make sure that nothing happens when it comes to the Gaza front. And, we all know the reasons why, and
we all know
political.
The reasons why. Yes.
Yeah, they're political. It's not strategic. It's not security. It's political 100%. But I just have a very hard time getting over that and setting it aside, given what the stakes are when it comes to the lack of a resolution to all these Gaza issues.
Yeah, and I'm going to be competing, Michael, for the pessimist here. I mean, because we do have to listen. There's no really comparison where we were in the beginning of the year, in the middle of the year. But yesterday, my kids came back with their shirts were torn down because they had to lie on the road because there was a siren of a ballistic missile coming from Yemen. We are still in that. And I know that it's remarkable that we were so afraid of the implications of a war with Hezbollah. We had a war with Hezbollah. It wasn't the full-on war that we were scared about, but we had over a year of a war with Hezbollah, which shattered the north of Israel and made our lives pretty miserable. And it's true that someone actually told me this when I said something about the sirens and the daily barrages of 100 rockets, 200, Neri, you followed, but it was pretty big. Mm-hmm. Someone did tell me, you should be thankful that you're not sitting in the dark in your shelter and FEMA or Homeland Security officers bring you food every 3 days. Yeah, well, if this is your standard, we're not that bad off. But
that's not a minor point.
No, but until 3 weeks ago, ceasefire. So if we're looking, it's hard to have long memory now. But if we're looking just at the last 3 weeks, we're in a better situation. But over this past year, the situation has been really grim. And I will say another thing. I agree that it was really wise. I think it took a little bit too long. It could have been done a week earlier, but to capitalize on the military achievements in Lebanon to reach a ceasefire that I hope would be more durable. But what I'm talking about is sort of the next step, right? What does Israel do and the United States, right, to fill the vacuum? Because, Hezbollah is weak, but it's not gone, and it will find a way to strengthen if nothing else comes between. If we don't make the effort to strengthen the Lebanese institutions, the LAF, right? Iran, Russia, they're the experts in filling the vacuums and capitalizing on our military achievements. And this is where this is where I'm a little bit more, less celebratory, I guess, in my thinking of where we are at the moment.
LAF for our listeners, obviously the Lebanese armed forces. And yeah, it's a good point that Hezbollah still exists and they are definitely wily and canny operators. I don't know how much bandwidth, resources, leverage Russia and Iran currently have in the Eastern Mediterranean to dictate terms in Lebanon or anywhere else. But that, again, remains to be seen and will also have a lot to do with U.S. policy moving forward. We'll get to that in just a moment, too. Let's get to Syria, because you both have not been on since, the big news transpired. I'm very curious to get your thoughts on the fall of the Assad regime in general, the rise of this jihadist rebel alliance in Damascus, what it all means for Israel. Shira, let's start with you this time. Are you happy, understanding, critical, pick your emotion and adjective, of what Israel has done so far vis-a-vis Syria from the air against the Assad's former army, or on the ground, taking the buffer zone on the Syrian Golan Heights and the very top of Mount Hermon? How do you view things up northeast?
Okay, so first, because we haven't been here a long time, of course, the removal of Assad, Assad's fall is an incredible development, and for anyone who cares about people's lives anywhere, right? He was one of the worst vicious dictators, and it's a tough competition in this region and worldwide. And it's good that he's no longer controlling Syria. As for what Israel has done and continues to do, I think there are two parts to it also. One thing, it's very understandable why Israel would go after important platforms, the Air Force, the Navy. By the way, there's still loose chemical weapons or chemical residues around Syria. Israel looking for WMDs, Israel looking for strategic facility. Absolutely. It's too risky at the moment for Israel to leave those around for non-state actors. And we really have to see how the events in Syria unfold. I think that this whole public posturing of Israeli and Prime Minister also essentially taking over territory on Syria's land, saying that a ceasefire agreement, an international ceasefire agreement, is no longer valid, and doing it in a way so public, alienating the Syrians and the Lebanese and many others. To me, it feels just like for domestic political reasons, but it has no strategic regional rationale.
Okay, tough stuff. So you don't buy the argument that it's a buffer against jihadists potentially taking over the border region. Although, as someone on Twitter said, the Golan Heights was supposed to be the buffer zone for Israel. So the buffer
right,
zone
the Golan Heights
is a buffer for the buffer.
Right. And I will say, maybe you can convince me you can have a buffer, but why do you have to be so public about it? Why do we need Israeli pictures and flags and BB? There are ways to do these things in coordination with the international community. To me, the whole public part of it is really only for domestic purposes here in Israel, and we'll connect it probably to other things. But this is the reason Netanyahu used, I think it's an excuse, to skip a day in court yesterday, right? And I'll just end the sentence with that, i.e., like everything that has happened in this country since October 7th, it's very difficult to separate between what might sound like a rational action and from thinking that there are political motivations that underlie it.
I think in Bibi Netanyahu's case, definitely political motivations, sometimes strategic motivations. It depends on the day and on the issue. Michael, what were your thoughts about Syria and Israel's actions in Syria?
Assad's fall, without question, is great. Great for Syrians first and foremost. Great for the Israelis as well, given that Syria was thoroughly controlled by the Iranians. And this cuts off Hezbollah even more because the land bridge from Iran to Lebanon across Syria for weapons is now functionally gone. So, it's certainly exciting. But I do think that a number of risks abound. The first one is that smashing the Iranian axis is great, but it won't be a good development for Israel if it is replaced by a different sort of axis. And while Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and its leaders have been saying all of the right and politically correct things, I suppose, about Israel and their plans for anything beyond their own borders, ultimately these guys used to be in league with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, and they broke away not for ideological reasons. They broke away for political and bureaucratic reasons. So you do have these radical Sunni jihadis, even if they claim to be something different, who are running Syria. And that poses two big risks. One is, particularly if fighting continues, and with different groups, including the United States and Turkey and Israel and Iran, backing all sorts of different players in Syria, there is a risk that you do have continued fighting. If you get a failed state on Israel's border, so is that better than having an Iranian proxy? Maybe, but it's not great for Israeli stability or a safe and secure border. And the bigger risk, I think, is that you've got some real bad Sunni jihadis in Jordan and in the West Bank who look at these guys in Syria as ideological bedfellows. And, we can think back not even 15 years ago to the Arab Spring and the worry that all of a sudden Muslim Brotherhood movements were going to take over across the region, and all of these Sunni monarchies and presidencies were concerned about what that would look like. Well, if things go the wrong way, you could very well have a Sunni Islamist arc that goes from the West Bank through Syria and Jordan. And that will, again, we can argue about whether that is better or worse than having an Iranian axis of resistance, but it won't be good in a normative sense. And so I think that Israel's got to be careful and just keep an eye on things on that front and do everything it can to shore up Jordan and to shore up the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank to prevent something like that from happening. The other thing that I've got my eye on is Turkey, because Turkey is so far in a conventional sense, the biggest winner of what happened in Syria. Not only has Turkey supported the two most successful rebel groups here, they almost certainly influenced the timing of the charge against Assad. They're in many ways in the driver's seat. And this goes back to an old argument that Shira and I have had on this podcast more than once, but I do not see Turkey as a good actor in any regard. I think that the Turks in some ways have a similar problem and maybe bias as the Israelis have in sometimes thinking that they have the ability to engineer outcomes more than they do.
Okay.
They're going to be in Syria in all sorts of ways. Erdogan certainly thinks that not only can he control HTS, but that perhaps this is going to give him outside influence throughout the wider region, in Gaza, in the Palestinian arena, in all sorts of places. And Turkey under Erdogan is obviously not friendly to Israel. Turkey is still hosting Hamas. There was a report in the Israeli press a couple of days ago that more weapons have actually been smuggled into the West Bank via Turkey than have via Jordan, which was the first I'd seen anything alleging that. But if it's true, that's massively problematic. So again, would you rather have Turkey than Iran being the dominant player in Syria? I think on balance, you'd have to argue yes, but it doesn't mean that just because there are relative gains here for Israel, it doesn't mean that you have absolute gains. And so, I think if I were the Israelis, I'd be keeping a very close eye on the Turks as well, and I'd be worried about that. And I think that, the last thing is Israel really has to avoid the temptation to try to engineer some sort of outcome in Syria. It's hard for anybody to do that. Israel has not been great at engineering outcomes in other places in the past, including in Lebanon, where it tried to do it for well over a decade and failed. I think that the Syrians are going to determine what happens here, with outside powers all jockeying to see what they can do. Israel should not be one of those outside powers. Staying on the Syrian side of the Hermon seems like the smart security move for now. But I hope that the Israeli government resists the temptation to try to engineer some sort of other outcome in Syria, because I don't think that it will be possible to control, and I don't think that it will go well for Israel in the end.
I think the Israelis are aware of that, at least publicly. They don't want to intervene in whatever is happening in Syria. It's also an open question to my mind how long you can keep IDF forces in that valley on the Syrian side of the Golan, right? It's not exactly a very defensible position if and when certain bad actors get their act together inside Syria and maybe want to go after Israeli soldiers. And I'm very happy that we had a Turkey mention, a cameo for the Turkey policy pod. But yes, in this case, I think it's well warranted what Erdogan plans to do in the Levant after his big victory in Syria. I'll let you fight it out with Shira about Erdogan's ultimate calculations.
That'll be a special bonus episode for people who want to pay extra for Israel Policy Pod.
Exactly. We'll look into that in the new year.
Exactly.
Okay, we'll be right back after this brief message.
During this period of upheaval in the Israeli-Palestinian arena, Israeli politics, U.S.-Israel relations, and regional affairs, Israel Policy Forum experts are shedding light on complex policy issues and breaking news developments impacting Israel's future as secure, Jewish, and democratic. Be sure to visit our website, subscribe to our emails, and follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Sky for timely explainers and analysis on key policy issues. Links to these platforms can be found in the show notes of this podcast. If you rely on Israel Policy Forum for credible, nuanced analysis, please make a gift today so that our work can continue to have an impact. Donate now at ipf.li/supportthepod or at the Support the Show link in the show notes.
Let's get to Gaza, because that's kind of been the big focus, aside from Syria, on this end in recent weeks, and really the prospects once again for a ceasefire for hostage deal. Obviously, reports in recent days have been quite positive. We like positive on this podcast. We're nothing if not positive always, but we don't like gaslighting on this podcast. And we've definitely seen this movie many times over the past year, with reports that Israel and Hamas were close, very close to a deal, and then not. Shira, what do you think about the prospects this time for a deal? Some people actually think it could be days away. I personally have my doubts. What do you think?
Yeah, on this one, I'm going to be the optimist. We've been in this, as you said, in this movie before many, many times this year. Many times, not for bad intentions, but many times it was actually U.S. administration that says that we are very close to a deal, right? Very close to a deal. How many times did we hear this? When in fact, we were not close to a deal at all. I do think the situation is different this time. I am saying it based on conversations, multiple, with people who are also in important rooms, who were skeptical all throughout the last year and are now saying there is a movement. Something is happening. I actually think that it will not, I don't know if it's going to happen in the next few days, but this cynicism we may have is sort of like a homecoming present to Donald Trump entering the White House. I think it's going to happen before. We're talking about a deal in 2 stages. This is the issue, right? It's not a deal that would necessarily bring everyone home. The numbers that I can share here, the estimates that I have of live hostages between 42 and 48. There are people that think that we're talking about even less live people. And if we're seeing reports that Israel demanded 34 hostages in the first deal, it gets you maybe everyone who's alive. Not that I'm dismissing, obviously, the need to bring back home the deceased, for burial in Israel. But obviously the priority is for those who are still alive. And this will also bring to an end of the war in some form, right? Even we should admit it, the war ended, right? There's some fighting going on, but the war, the big war ended. But again, for political reasons, we don't have a prime minister who is willing to say that. The reason that I think, obviously the Trump factor is a huge one, right? There's a clear shared interest between the Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration on this, as there was in Lebanon. The same rationale for the deal that we had in Lebanon, right? That you have some sort of a ceasefire agreement with assurances. We don't call it the end of war. We call it ceasefire. You can apply the same thing, really, in Gaza. Politically, Netanyahu is growing in the polls. And it's going to be much harder for him, his coalition members who have threatened before to break the coalition for what they call a terrible deal. it will be much harder for them to do it if it comes as a request from Trump. So I think, obviously there's the military and all the rationale around, but we have several factors here that make me think it could be coming. And I haven't mentioned Hamas. Hamas, the one big achievement, right, of this, when we're talking about the achievements of the past war, the past year, is breaking the different links in the Iranian ring of fire that they try to create around Israel, right? Hamas started the attack on October 7th, and then October 8th, we had others join in. Even though they didn't know, they joined in, and maybe they didn't join in the more full capacity. That could have been worse, but they did join in. And Hamas is now isolated, right? There's no Syria. I mean, there's no Syria the way that there was. It's a weird affiliation between Hamas and, the relationship there with Assad is a bit strange. But
now Hamas is denying that there was ever a relationship. It's incredible. But sorry, I had to.
Yeah. No, I think they had a sulha, right? They repaired ties. But they're talking about Syria and obviously Lebanon, Hezbollah, and it's decapitated, right? Hamas is really in a very different situation than it was. So they're weak and are willing to make more compromises. And therefore, Neri, on this one, I am more optimistic that finally we will have some good news. I mean, we have to bring whoever we can home.
Absolutely. I'll give you my thoughts in a second. Michael, are you as optimistic as Shira?
Well, I desperately hope that Shira is correct, and I am rooting for her optimism to win out. I'm not as optimistic as Shira is for a few reasons. So I've heard from U.S. officials who are less optimistic than the public reporting is. So, that's one aspect of it. But let's leave that part aside for a moment. I do think that Trump's intervention has absolutely been helpful here. It seems as if his bluster is certainly pushing the Israelis. Whether it's pushing Hamas or not, Hamas is talking about being more willing to compromise, but we have heard that in the past from Hamas leaders. We heard that before Sinwar was killed. We heard it after Sinwar was killed. It didn't seem to actually ever operationalize. I go back and forth in my own head about Hamas being isolated, whether that actually matters in the end. They've been isolated for a while. So yes, they're more isolated now with the severing of the link between Hamas and Hezbollah and between the Gaza front and Lebanon front. But it's not like the rush to their assistance that Sinwar was expecting after October 7th ever happened. And ultimately, they remain a deeply ideological group that is still fighting a guerrilla war against the IDF in Gaza. So their level of isolation and what that means for the hostage talks, I'm honestly not sure. But the biggest factor for me is the Israeli side of things. So let's assume for a moment that Netanyahu actually is scared of Trump and wants some sort of deal before January 20th. It's still pretty clear that Smotrich and Ben-Gvir don't. Now, as we've seen, once Netanyahu brought Saar and his 4 seats into the government, that gave him a buffer against one of those two defecting, but he still doesn't have a buffer against both.
Exactly.
Right. And so what we're seeing now, it's actually an interesting comparison, right? In the budget issue, just yesterday, Ben-Gvir and his party did not vote for the first version of the budget in the Knesset, and it passed anyway, because you can lose Ben-Gvir, and Smotrich voted for the budget. But on this issue of the hostages and a ceasefire, I think that Bibi probably loses both. And just, I think it was either today or yesterday, Smotrich again came out against a deal, said that
this morning
he's against this morning. Okay. So, said he's against a partial deal, which is what this is, says he's against anything that will remove the IDF from Gaza, says he's against anything that will allow Palestinians to return to northern Gaza. Well, guess what? That's the deal. So, he's against it. And Ben-Gvir, has been raging against any deal of any sort now, basically since the beginning. So if you lose both of them, can Bibi still do it? Sure, he can, because this isn't a Knesset vote, but is he willing to actually buck them and then risk them defecting from him when it comes to supporting the government? We've seen one ironclad rule of Bibi Netanyahu now forever, but certainly over the past 5 years, which is that the one line he will not cross is risking his government and risking staying in power. And so the question is whether both of these guys are bluffing over this and how seriously Netanyahu takes their threats. And I think that we can talk all we want about changed circumstances and Hamas's isolation and Israel having won the actual war. That's all 100% true. But if it doesn't change the fundamental calculus politically for Netanyahu, then none of it matters. And I also think that this idea that Bibi cannot say no to Trump, that may be true in the beginning. I don't think that over time that's going to hold. He's going to find ways to say no to Trump. And he's going to find ways to buck him. And he did it in instances last time as well. So there weren't that many opportunities to do it because they were aligned on most things. But the notion that Bibi is going to risk his government because Trump tells him to, I think ultimately he's not going to do that. He may be far more scared of Trump than he is of Biden, but not to the point of giving up power and subjecting himself to a trial without any protection or immunity. So I think that the political angle here is still difficult from the Israeli side. As I said, desperately hope that it gets overcome, and I absolutely endorse I endorse Shira's position with every single ounce of my heart. But I worry that the level of optimism right now is maybe higher than is warranted.
Hold your Trump thoughts for just a bit longer, and I have to say I'm more in Michael's camp than Shira's camp for the simple reason that, like you said, Michael, it would be a major political lift for Netanyahu to actually agree to certain things that I don't quite see how Hamas itself is willing to agree unless it completely caves. And that scenario also unlikely because they don't have that much to lose at this point. Things like you said, allowing Gazans back into northern Gaza. That's a major red line for the Israeli far right for reasons that we all know. They are looking at northern Gaza as potentially a new settlement area, or the number of Palestinian prisoners to be released. Likely it'll be hundreds, right? Smotrich this morning said he doesn't want to give his hand to that. I think the IDF redeployments inside the Strip can be fudged. I think a first stage of the deal is possible, but even Netanyahu says he's not willing to end the war, right? So if he's not willing to end the war, and that's really the core Hamas demand, and as Shira said, the number of live hostages aren't that great, then if Netanyahu is demanding 30 plus live hostages just in the first stage, that's Hamas's only insurance policy. So why would they agree to basically give up most, if not nearly all, of the living hostages in the first stage when Netanyahu has made clear that there's only going to be one stage to this deal? So again, what they call the zone of possible agreement, I'm still skeptical. Again, unless Netanyahu surprises us.
Listen, I agree with you. I don't think we're going to get the full deal. I think that we are not going to see what we all want to see, but something is going to happen. There's going to be a partial deal, I think, because it's less of a political risk currently for Netanyahu than it was a few months ago. Because of the Trump effect and because of other considerations, because he bolstered his coalition with Gideon Sa'ar and others. And I want to remind you, it doesn't matter what Smotrich said. He voted for the first deal. Ben-Gvir didn't,
yeah, but
obviously.
Right. The first
so
deal
I'm
was
saying it depends
a
how
deal.
they frame it, and the stages is the issue. I think the stages. I agree with you that Hamas will want to sustain, this is their insurance policy. We're not going to see everyone. The 34 in the first stage, to me, is a fantasy, right? What is reported that Israel's asking. But I do think that we have much better chances of a partial deal than we had last time we were speaking about this.
We might. I'll also note, though, that today, concurrent with Smotrich's interview, all of a sudden there's like a rash of stories about how the two sides actually aren't as close as people claim, and they're still arguing over the names of Israeli hostages, and how many will be released, and what the ratio will be of Israeli hostages to Palestinian prisoners, and exactly where the IDF will redeploy. So, again, I desperately hope Shira is right. But I don't know. Again, maybe I'm just too much of a Debbie Downer across the board.
And look,
I'm not as optimistic.
I'm old enough because it only happened in September, which was 3 months ago, to remember.
And you just had your birthday.
I did, as did you, by the way. Another year, another year around the sun. Although this past year, I think, went by both much quicker than previous years, and also just seemed like it took forever. Difficult year. But 3 months ago, to get back on track here, Netanyahu pinned all of Israel's entire existence on holding the Philadelphia corridor. Right now, you can find some formula to dilute the idea of presence on the Philadelphia corridor, but that's still a major concession for Netanyahu, and that was only 3 months ago. Or holding the Netzarim corridor in the middle of the Strip and allowing Gazans to go back north. By the way, in the first stage, it's also a major concession. So not easy, despite what everyone's actually on their best behavior, trying to at least show Trump that they're working towards an agreement. Again, I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. 1 stage, 2 stages, whatever, as long as Israelis come back. But I'm still very, very skeptical. So it remains to be seen. On the topic of Bibi Netanyahu, we have to get into him, and also we'll end with Donald Trump, obviously, because we are heading into 2025, and he will be U.S. president at the end of January. But let's start with Bibi. As Shira mentioned, his political position domestically undoubtedly strengthened over the last 3.5 months. Victories on the battlefields, victories domestic politics with Gideon Sa'ar, victory in the U.S. general election. It's not a very well kept secret, obviously. But on the other hand, he's now in court 3 times a week for 6 hours at a time, giving testimony in his own corruption trial. His government is back promoting the wholly destructive and I'll say insane judicial overhaul agenda that nearly tore this country apart before October 7th. And he may have some difficult political and diplomatic decisions to make in the not so distant future. So, Michael, your sense of Bibi at the end of 2024 and heading into 2025. I'm also old enough to remember, it wasn't that long ago, that you and I were basically saying that after October 7th, Netanyahu was still walking around acting like he's the prime minister of Israel, but he has no future. He's done. And I dare say I was probably wrong on that front, counting him out maybe a bit too soon once again.
Yeah, I've lost track of how many times I use the line in various places that the only person who doesn't understand that his career is over is Bibi Netanyahu.
Exactly. You said on this podcast.
On this podcast and plenty of other spots too. So I still find it difficult to see how he remains prime minister after the next election, whenever that is. But it increasingly seems like he's got another 22 months before he gets to that election. He's obviously in a better spot than he was 3 months ago or 6 months ago or a year ago because of the military victories, because of Gideon Sa'ar. But he still is down in the polls. His coalition still isn't anywhere close to a majority of the Knesset. Of course, a lot depends on what happens next, and if Naftali Bennett rejoins politics and everything else. But he's in a better spot, but I don't think that his long-term outlook has fundamentally improved all that much. And he still does have a number of things looming in front of him that should have him worried. Donald Trump is definitely one of them, given his unpredictability and the fact that he's transactional with everyone and everything, and that will include Israel and Bibi Netanyahu. He still has to figure out a way to resolve the Haredi draft issue. He still does have to get a budget passed. He still does have the threats from Ben Gvir and Smotrich over all sorts of things. He now faces the prospect of Yariv Levin and other folks in Likud reviving the judicial overhaul at a time that maybe is not terribly convenient for Netanyahu politically. So he's not by any means out of the woods, but he certainly looks like he's going to remain where he is until the next election absolutely has to happen, which isn't until October 2026. So yeah, I tip my cap to Bibi Netanyahu. Once again, he is smarter and more clever and more durable than certainly than I give him credit for. He somehow stays on top. The guy is impressive in that regard. Maybe above all other regards.
Yeah, for once on this podcast, I'll refrain from giving my actual thoughts, I'll be diplomatic like Shira at the UN Security Council. Suffice to say that, cynicism, ruthlessness, low morals, and the like also assist a politician in remaining in power at all costs. Shira, Bibi Netanyahu at the end of this year and heading into 2025?
I mean, like you all, right? We thought after October 7th, this would be the end of this government after, 10 months of protests on the streets before low support. Lo and behold, it has a lot to do with his many, many, many talents. I'm sure there's a sports metaphor for this, but I think it's that the other team didn't show up. There's really no opposition in Israel. We got to face it. There's no opposition. Not that I criticize their decision, but, Benny Gantz, right, joined the government at the beginning, stayed in the government for much longer than he needed when it was clearly not going in the right direction. I do think it was important when they got into the government, but they stayed in. The others are making statements and other things, but they're not criticizing this government the ways that, can you just imagine that Netanyahu was in the opposition and October 7th would have happened under someone else's term? I mean,
yeah, this country would have come to a standstill.
They would not be prime minister anymore. Let's say that. Okay?
Yeah.
It's hard to talk about the counterfactual, but this is one that I am pretty confident that if Netanyahu was in the opposition, this happened to someone, not to someone, it happened to all of us, but sort of under the prime responsibility, right, of another prime minister, this person wouldn't be prime minister now. It hasn't happened. And we'll see what he has. Also, his gambit on Donald Trump, which I know you're keeping it to the end, but it paid off, right? With behavior. I think Michael said that Netanyahu treated Biden like a doormat or a dish rag, or you had other objects.
It was one of those, if not both.
Right. And it paid off. And strategically, as we discussed before, the situation in the region is much better. So I don't see him. Yes, in the polls, his coalition, sort of the Netanyahu bloc, is still weaker, but he's gaining. They're gaining. And, his main contender is Naftali Bennett, who's formally not even in the race, and we don't have elections anytime soon. So we'll see. And, for those of you who follow some of I do give credit to the legal system here, because I didn't think that he would be in court 3 days a week. He's not in court 3 days a week because, like yesterday, there was an excuse to not attend. But still, I never thought this would happen. We're yet to see what is happening here. There is the budget that has to pass by March. Otherwise, the coalition does break down. And we'll see what happens with Trump and the many plans that Netanyahu has. That we didn't speak about Iran as a topic on its own, right? Just about the proxies. But the real show, the big discussion that is happening in Israel is about Iran. Israel and this government is trying to seize an opportunity, and not just the government in striking Iran, maybe not the nuclear facilities for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's too late, but yes, maybe government figures. There is talk about regime change that I thought is crazy, but apparently it's a serious talk. And so those videos that Netanyahu sends to the Iranian people, they come in a bigger context. So we'll see.
The Shmate doctrine that Bibi employed vis-a-vis the Biden administration definitely paid off. And I suppose it was a two-way street that the Biden administration allowed itself to be played for much of this past year. And their gamble in terms of their own, I think, domestic electoral considerations backfired and did not produce a victory for the Democratic candidate, and Netanyahu won. And now, in almost exactly a month, Donald Trump will take office. Michael, actually, Shira, I wanted to talk with you about this. I mean, you jumping off your point about Iran, Bibi Netanyahu and this Israeli government and whoever else is sitting around the table plotting whatever they're plotting vis-a-vis Iran, they're going to have buy-in from Donald Trump. And do you believe Donald Trump would greenlight, Israeli strikes on Iran, Israeli strikes somewhere else? We do know that Donald Trump, how did he put it on election night? He doesn't start wars, he ends wars. So obviously this issue, along with many other issues, are contingent on Donald Trump.
I mean, right, this is the sort of I'd use my science days, right? The free radical, right? Trump, he's the only thing we can say about him with full confidence is that he's unpredictable, and this unpredictability is something that he keeps as sort of as an asset. We don't know. But you speak with, and I was in DC last week and spoke with people who also served in the previous Trump administration. And it's fine that he says he doesn't, begin wars, that he ends wars. But it's not just words, right? Let's also look, he was president before. So we can look at sort of his revealed preferences, what he chose to do. And he's not a warmonger, right?
Mm-hmm.
He didn't retaliate to some of the Iranian strikes that hurt, Saudi Aramco, but also U.S. interest. Yeah, there was Soleimani, but Soleimani was like a standoff, right? It's a different thing than a full-on war. I can't even tell you for sure that Trump would be convinced to keep the U.S. military mission in Syria, which is, much smaller, has a bigger return on investment. And he's talking about a deal with Iran.
Mm-hmm.
If he wants to end wars, to pivot to Asia in a serious way, at least what he says. If you look at Hagstead, but it's not just him. When we talk about the sentiment, right? I don't think Americans, it's not just, by the way, Trump, the forever wars in the, no, but also, other, right? It's not a Republican or Democrat. I think this concept of like forever wars in the Middle East is something that Americans across the board are fed up with. And Trump is also one of them. So to me, I think there's overexcitement in Israel in terms of what Trump will greenlight or not greenlight and the cooperation, because for a meaningful strike in Iran, Israel would need not only the Trump administration's green light, but it will also need, backup. And it could require sending military assets or maintaining the current military posture in the region, which to me is something that I don't see Trump doing, right? Those things also cost money. This is, by the way, one of the things are not favorite topic, right? But everyone is talking all the time about, the Saudis.
Mm-hmm.
The Saudis won from the United States a defense treaty. I'm not sure Trump that talks about backing away from alliances, but also from the Middle East, right, at large, is going to go and put in more assets in the Middle East. And so I hope this plan stops in Washington, not because I don't think the Iranian people deserve better leadership, right? I just feel that it would be advisable if people read some books from the past about experiences to do forced regime change in the country, in Iran, and where those led us. I don't think this is something that Israel can do. But we'll have to see. We'll have to see people, yeah. So
I choose to hear Shira agreeing with my sentiment. I like that. Michael, what do you expect from the incoming U.S. president in about a month?
I agree with Shira. I'm skeptical that Trump wants to see a strike on Iran. And we know from Trump himself, right? He likes to boast that towards the end of his last term, he says that the U.S. military was urging him to strike Iranian nuclear facilities, and he said no. And he loves to talk about himself as bringing peace and being a peacemaker and all of that. I do think, though, that there is an argument from the other side, even though, as I'll reiterate, I don't think that Trump is going to greenlight this, but there's an argument that he might, and the argument is as follows. A, he's surrounded by a lot of people who have been hawkish on this and will be telling him that this is something that he should do. Second, he loves the idea of something happening that other countries will do that the United States does not have to do. And in this instance, if the Israeli government comes to Trump and says, hey, listen, there's this huge problem. The Iranians are about to get a nuclear weapon, or, at least get nuclear capability. You don't want to be the American president on whose watch this happens. But guess what? We'll take care of the problem for you. You just have to give us some of the things that we need and some logistical support, and we'll do it on our own. Taking care of our problems by ourselves. That's the sort of thing that Trump loves to talk about and loves to see. So there's that part of it as well. And I think that if someone, Bibi Netanyahu or otherwise, can convince him that this will be relatively low risk, the Iranians are exposed in a way that they've never been exposed, this will be great for the region overall, and the burden of it will not fall on the United States, then Trump very well might say, all right, you want to do it, you got my blessing. Go ahead. If it goes south on you, then that's that's going to be on you. But no argument from me. And if he does that, then we very well could see an Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities relatively quickly. So I certainly don't think it's impossible, even as I agree that it doesn't really seem to be in Trump's nature based on what we know of him from what he says and what he did last time, but certainly not impossible and not an outcome that would surprise me if it happens.
But as well as I do that Bibi Netanyahu may and likely will make that argument, but then the Emiratis, the Saudis, the other Arab leaders will come to Trump and say, yeah, this is a really bad idea.
Yes, I agree. But if you have insight into how Trump weighs different things and makes decisions, then you can be somewhere else making a lot more money. I certainly don't have that insight. So, if it plays out that way, who does he go with? I have no idea.
And final, I suppose, Trump-related question to you both: a Saudi deal. Is there any prospect that it's revived under a President Trump? And I mean, not to belabor the point, but can Israel actually give the Saudis what they seemingly want on the Palestinian issue, i.e. some credible pathway to Palestinian statehood in return for normalization, in return for a Saudi defense pact with the U.S.? What do we think about that big ticket item on Trump's Middle East plate? Shira?
I mean, of course, Israel can give the Saudis a credible pathway toward a Palestinian state. The question is, there's willingness.
Can this Israeli government give that?
It's very difficult to speak about this Israeli government in its form. I think for exactly what we spoke about before, the zone of possible agreement, right? The ZOPA. It'll be impossible even to utter the words. The desk I'm sitting next to, if you call this thing a Palestinian state, Smotrich is out of the government. So there is a question what you can do with this government, but there's no question, and they also said it, that if Netanyahu wanted to have a Saudi deal, he can have other coalition partners replacing Smotrich, which maybe he doesn't want to have because of he needs a safety net against because of the legal issues and others. It's interesting as Israel's hardening its positions, right? And we're seeing what's happening in Gaza, and there's a real threat of Jewish settlements there and elsewhere. The Saudis seem to be hardening their positions also. We heard not just the foreign ministry, right? MBS himself, and in the gathering speaking about Israel's genocide in Gaza. I mean, obviously, using terminology we're not used to hearing from him, and definitely not from someone that, what was it, a year and a half ago, less than a year and a half ago, said that, he's eager about normalization with Israel, and it's a question of when and not of if. I don't remember the exact words. But also, if you hear from people in the Saudi foreign ministry, which has always taken a much more traditional stance on these issues, they are saying, and I think that's really interesting, that they are not allowed now, because of Israel's position, they're not allowed now to even use the words process or political horizon in their documents. They have to use this sort of credible pathway to statehood. With that said, and this is the political will, right? If Israel would be less oppositional to something in that realm, I'm sure that in the Venn diagrams of what meets, Saudi requirement and Israeli requirement, and maybe a U.S. requirement, which is this is the bigger issue, I think, under Trump. There's certainly something that can do. We can talk about, the defense treaty and what the Saudis want, right? They don't want it, depending who we ask, but there's no eagerness for normalization with Israel. They're not getting stuff out. They're not going to get stuff out of Israel that it's impossible to get, let's say, without an agreement. The urgency is getting the goodies from the United States, and I'm sure the Saudis will do what they did last time and spend tons of money in the U.S. under Trump. This is the way to get to his heart. But then there's a question of also, you will need to convince for a defense treaty. You'll also need to convince, is it 15 Democrats in the Senate? And they will also want something on the Palestinian file, I hope, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong. So in a sense, it was rational to think that it would be easier under the Biden administration to do it. And who knows? We might be surprised. I don't think it's happening under the Biden administration, despite promises. No. For the past, we have, right, the bi-weekly promise that we're on a breakthrough. But it's not out of their of possibilities, but it's going to be even more difficult with Trump. Not sure what Michael thinks.
nothing is impossible, of course, and Trump is going to push for it, I think, incredibly hard. And, he's going to bring it up all the time and set it as a goal. And there's going to be lots of pressure that he brings to bear on everybody to get it done. But it's going to be a lot more difficult now because of everything Shira brought up, because of the Israeli political dynamics, and because of what it now means for Democrats to have to vote for it if it's coming from Trump and, not just any Republican president, but, this particular Republican president. Yesterday, there was this Chaim Levinson report in Haaretz that there was some sort of breakthrough where Israel and Saudi had agreed to move forward on the basis of Israel vaguely promising to consider a pathway to Palestinian statehood. I got like literally 15 texts and WhatsApps all simultaneously asking me like what was going on. And of course, like clockwork, an hour later, Shira WhatsApps me the statement from the Prime Minister's Bureau saying that it's a complete lie that Israel would ever consider a pathway to Palestinian statehood, and that the Prime Minister has worked and is continuing to work against any Palestinian state. So even like this report that, by the way, didn't even really have anything new. It was kind of an inflammatory headline laying out what we've known now for a while. Even that was a bridge too far for the Prime Minister. So I just, it's so difficult for me to envision this being an easy thing, given what's going on in Gaza and given what's going on in the West Bank, and what the Saudis need and what the Israeli far right needs. Again, not impossible, but very difficult. And I think that it's going to become even that much more difficult once, the conventional wisdom that you get a ceasefire in Gaza and then all of a sudden it's kind of quick, right? I think that once there's a ceasefire in Gaza and Palestinians start going back, and maybe more importantly, international press starts going to Gaza, and just the magnitude of what has gone on there becomes even more clear. I suspect that that's going to actually make it even more difficult for the Saudis, not easier. And this is not going to be an easy thing just because Trump is in office and wants normalization really badly.
It's a good point about, well, if and when this war ends and kind of the post-war reality in Gaza, but also diplomatically in the region and across the world. And I have a whole theory about that Haaretz article last night, but we'll talk about it offline.
Oh, please share, Neri. Come on.
Yes,
we'll be here for another half hour, and our time is coming to a close. If people are interested, then they'll have to listen to the Israel Policy Pod in the new year. That's a very simple solution.
Maybe this should be another subject for the premium subscriber, pay subscriber only Israel Policy Pod.
It's very, very I'll assess this over the holidays. But on a more serious note, I wanted to wish you both, as well as our dear listeners, a healthy and happy holiday season. Best wishes for the new year, and hopefully 2025 will be a better year than this past year, which obviously was quite difficult and was obviously pocked by war over the past 12 months. So with that, good tidings to you both, and looking forward to chatting with you both next year in 2025.
Same here. Thank you, Neri, and thank you, Shira.
Same here. And let's pray for the hostages to come back home and for this war to end.
Most importantly, amen. Take care. Okay, thanks again to Michael Koplow and Shira Efron, as always, for their generous time and insights. Also, a special thanks to our producer, Jacob Gilman, and to all of you who support Israel Policy Forum's work. Once again, 'tis the season, so do consider making a donation to Israel Policy Forum so we can keep being a credible source of analysis and ideas on issues such as these that we all care deeply about, including, of course, this podcast. Merry Christmas, Chag Sameach, and Happy New Year upcoming. And most importantly, thank you for listening.